Hey everyone, tonight we're drifting back to a small island in the Pacific. So dim the lights, get comfortable, and let your mind wander into one of the strangest true stories of the 20th century. It's a story about war, but not really about battles. It's a story about routine, loyalty, loneliness, and one man who followed his orders so faithfully that he continued fighting a war for nearly 30 years after everyone else had gone home. Before we begin, take a slow breath. The world around you can wait for a little while. Tonight, we're visiting the life of a soldier who became trapped inside history itself. His name was Hiroo Onoda. Hiroo Onoda was born in Japan in 1922. At the time, Japan was becoming increasingly militarized. Young boys grew up hearing constant messages about duty, sacrifice, and loyalty to the emperor. These ideas were present everywhere, in schools, newspapers, and everyday conversations. Onoda grew up in this atmosphere and, like many young men of his generation, eventually found himself pulled into the expanding conflict that would become World War II. Before joining the military, Onoda worked for a trading company. His future might have been perfectly ordinary. He could have spent his life handling business transactions and living a quiet existence. History, however, had other plans. In 1942, he was drafted into the Japanese army. He was only 20 years old. Like countless young soldiers throughout history, he stepped into a world that would shape the rest of his life in ways he could never have imagined. During his military training, Onoda proved disciplined and reliable. These qualities eventually earned him specialized instruction in intelligence and guerrilla warfare. Unlike many soldiers who were trained primarily for conventional combat, Onoda learned how to survive behind enemy lines. He studied sabotage, intelligence gathering, and resistance tactics. Most importantly, he was taught never to surrender. His instructors repeatedly emphasized that a mission must continue no matter how difficult circumstances became. These lessons became deeply rooted in his thinking. By late 1944, Japan's position in the war was becoming increasingly desperate. American forces were advancing across the Pacific, capturing island after island. As military planners searched for ways to slow the Allied advance, Onoda received new orders. He was assigned to Lubang Island in the Philippines. It was a small tropical island surrounded by beautiful scenery, dense forests, and rolling hills. Under normal circumstances, it might have seemed like paradise. During wartime, however, it became something very different. Before leaving for Lubang, Onoda received instructions from his commanding officer that would define the rest of his life. He was ordered to continue resistance operations, avoid surrender at all costs, and wait for future orders. Those instructions may have sounded routine at the time. Countless soldiers throughout history have received similar commands. Yet in Onoda's case, they would become almost sacred. He accepted them completely and never forgot them. In February 1945, Allied forces landed on Lubang Island. Japanese defenses collapsed quickly. Many soldiers were killed. Others surrendered. Onoda did neither. Instead, he disappeared into the jungle along with 3 fellow soldiers. Together, they formed a small group of holdouts determined to continue their mission. They believed Japan would eventually return. They believed reinforcements would arrive. Most importantly, they believed the war was still being fought. Life in the jungle was difficult. Food had to be gathered constantly. Shelter had to be improvised. Equipment needed maintenance. Every day became a struggle for survival. The men stole rice from local farms, collected fruit, hunted animals, and moved frequently to avoid detection. They remained armed and alert. Their entire existence revolved around staying alive and preparing for a future military campaign that would never come. The war ended later that year. Japan surrendered in August 1945. Across the world, celebrations erupted as soldiers returned home and nations began rebuilding. Yet deep within the forests of Lubang Island, Onoda and his companions knew nothing of this new reality. Even when leaflets were dropped from airplanes announcing the war's end, they dismissed them as enemy propaganda. Newspapers appeared. Letters from family members arrived. Messages were delivered repeatedly. Every attempt to inform them of Japan's surrender was rejected. From their perspective, suspicion seemed reasonable. They had been trained specifically to distrust enemy information. Any announcement claiming the war was over looked exactly like the sort of trick they had been warned about. The more evidence appeared, the more convinced they became that it was part of a deception. Their isolation reinforced these beliefs year after year. As time passed, the group slowly shrank. One soldier surrendered. Another was killed. Then another died during a confrontation with local authorities. Eventually, only Onoda remained. Alone in the jungle, he continued performing the same duties he had carried out for decades. He maintained his rifle carefully. He patrolled the forests. He watched for enemies. Every morning, he woke up believing his mission remained active. Meanwhile, the outside world transformed completely. Television spread across the globe. Humans landed on the moon. Entire generations were born and grew up. Governments rose and fell. Technology advanced rapidly. Fashion made several highly questionable decisions. Through all of it, Onoda remained frozen in 1945. His world never changed because he refused to believe it had changed. By the early 1970s, stories about a Japanese soldier still hiding in the Philippines had become famous. Many people assumed the reports were exaggerated. Surely nobody could continue believing World War II was active after nearly 3 decades. Yet the rumors were true. In 1974, a young Japanese adventurer named Norio Suzuki decided to search for him. Against all odds, Suzuki found Onoda in the jungle. The two men spoke at length and gradually developed trust. Suzuki explained that the war had ended long ago and that Japan wanted him to come home. Onoda listened carefully, but he refused to surrender. In his mind, only a direct order from his commanding officer could end the mission. Personal opinions did not matter. Newspaper articles did not matter. Even reality itself seemed less important than military authority. He had been given orders, and he intended to obey them. As a result, Japanese authorities located Onoda's former commanding officer, Major Yoshimi Taniguchi. Nearly 30 years after issuing the original orders, Taniguchi traveled to Lubang Island and formally relieved Onoda of duty. It was one of the most remarkable moments in military history. A soldier stood before his commander after 3 decades of separation and finally received permission to stop fighting. The war was over, at least for Hiroo Onoda. After nearly 30 years in the jungle, he could finally go home. In March of 1974, after nearly 30 years of living in the jungles of Lubang Island, Hiroo Onoda finally stepped out of hiding. The mission that had defined his entire adult life was officially over. His commanding officer had personally relieved him of duty, and for the first time since 1945, he no longer considered himself an active soldier. It was a simple moment on the surface, but it represented the end of one of the longest military holdouts in modern history. Imagine what that must have felt like. The last time Onoda had lived in ordinary society, World War II was still raging. The Japanese Empire still existed. Much of the world was locked in conflict. The atomic bombs had not yet fallen on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Television was still in its infancy. Commercial jet travel barely existed. Computers were giant machines hidden inside laboratories. Then, almost overnight from his perspective, he found himself standing in a completely different era. When Onoda surrendered, he handed over his rifle, ammunition, and military equipment. What shocked many observers was how well everything had been maintained. His rifle still functioned. His gear remained in surprisingly good condition. For nearly 3 decades, he had cared for his equipment as if military inspectors might arrive at any moment. The discipline drilled into him during his training had never faded. Even after all those years, he continued acting like a soldier waiting for orders. His surrender attracted enormous media attention. Journalists from around the world traveled to cover the story. Photographers documented every moment. Television crews eagerly followed him. To many people, Onoda seemed like a ghost from another century. He was a living reminder of World War II, a man who had somehow remained trapped inside a conflict that ended decades earlier. The situation, however, was not entirely straightforward. During his years in hiding, Onoda and the other holdouts had carried out raids, stolen supplies, and occasionally engaged in violent confrontations with local residents. Several people had lost their lives over the years. For those families, the story was not simply a fascinating historical curiosity. It was deeply personal. The consequences of the war had continued long after everyone else believed it was over. Questions immediately arose regarding whether Onoda would face legal consequences for actions committed during his years in the jungle. Eventually, the government of the Philippines chose a different path. President Ferdinand Marcos granted him a pardon, allowing him to return to Japan without facing prosecution. The decision removed a major obstacle and cleared the way for his return home. The journey back to Japan must have felt surreal. Nearly everything around him was unfamiliar. The world he remembered had disappeared. Commercial jet aircraft crossed oceans in hours. Airports buzzed with activity. Cities stretched farther into the sky than he could have imagined. The future had arrived while he was hiding in the jungle. When he landed in Japan, thousands of people welcomed him. Crowds gathered at airports. Reporters surrounded him. Newspapers filled their front pages with his story. For many Japanese citizens, Onoda represented an extraordinary example of endurance and loyalty. Others viewed him more cautiously, seeing him as a symbol of a militaristic past that Japan had worked hard to leave behind. Japan itself had transformed dramatically. The country that greeted him in 1974 was almost unrecognizable compared to the nation he had left behind in 1945. The devastation of war had long since been replaced by rapid economic growth. Modern highways connected cities. Factories produced cars and electronics that were exported around the world. Neon lights illuminated urban centers. Japan had become one of the world's leading economic powers. For Onoda, this transformation was difficult to process. He had spent nearly 30 years imagining a Japan still struggling through wartime conditions. Instead, he found a prosperous and highly modern society. The values, priorities, and daily routines of ordinary people seemed very different from the world he remembered. Many citizens focused on careers, technology, education, and economic success. The military culture that had shaped his youth no longer occupied the same central place in society. Like many people returning from long periods of isolation, Onoda found adaptation challenging. During his years in the jungle, life had been remarkably simple in one sense. Every day revolved around survival. Find food. Stay hidden. Remain alert. Maintain equipment. Repeat. The routine was exhausting but straightforward. Modern life introduced thousands of decisions and distractions that simply did not exist in the forest. Even small details could feel overwhelming. Supermarkets carried endless products. Television offered countless programs. Cities were crowded and noisy. Technology had advanced far beyond anything he had known before the war. While most people gradually adapt to change over time, Onoda experienced decades of change all at once. It was as though someone had compressed 30 years of history into a single afternoon. Despite the attention surrounding his return, he often felt disconnected from modern Japanese society. Interviews and public appearances brought fame, but they did not necessarily bring comfort. The country celebrated him, yet he sometimes struggled to understand the country that was celebrating him. The gap between his experiences and those of ordinary citizens felt enormous. Eventually, Onoda made a surprising decision. He left Japan and moved to Brazil. At first glance, it seemed like an unusual choice. Yet Brazil was home to one of the largest Japanese communities outside Japan itself. Large numbers of Japanese immigrants and their descendants had settled there over the years, creating communities where cultural traditions remained strong. In Brazil, Onoda found something he had been missing: space. Simplicity. Distance from constant media attention. He purchased a cattle ranch and began working as a rancher. After decades spent surviving in the jungle, life on a ranch probably felt refreshingly predictable. Cattle, unlike journalists, generally ask very few questions. The work suited him. Ranch life provided routine, structure, and independence. It allowed him to build a future, instead of endlessly revisiting the past. Gradually, he settled into his new environment and began creating a different kind of life for himself. During this period, he also married. After spending much of his adult life alone, marriage represented another major transition. It brought companionship and stability, two things largely absent from his years of isolation. For the first time in decades, he could focus on ordinary human concerns rather than survival. As the years passed, public fascination with his story remained strong. Books were published. Documentaries appeared. Historians analyzed his experiences. Psychologists studied the factors that allowed him to maintain his beliefs for so long. People around the world continued asking the same question. How could someone remain committed to a mission for nearly 30 years after it had become meaningless? Part of the answer lies in military training. Part lies in culture. Part lies in isolation. But another part involves something deeply human. Once people dedicate themselves completely to a belief or purpose, abandoning it can become incredibly difficult. The more years invested, the harder it becomes to admit that circumstances have changed. For Onoda, surrendering was not simply a military decision. It would have meant questioning decades of sacrifice, hardship, and endurance. Every year he remained in the jungle reinforced the decision to stay. Leaving became psychologically harder with each passing season. In many ways, he became trapped not by the jungle itself, but by the mission he believed he was still carrying out. Yet his story also reveals something remarkable about human resilience. Few people could survive in such conditions for so long. Fewer still could maintain the same level of discipline and focus year after year. While historians continue debating the meaning of his actions, almost everyone agrees on one point: his endurance was extraordinary. As Onoda grew older, he spent more time reflecting on his experiences. The young soldier who entered the jungle in 1945 had long since disappeared. In his place stood an older man trying to understand a life unlike any other. He had witnessed history from a perspective almost nobody else could claim. He had spent decades waiting for a war that had already ended, following orders that no longer mattered, and surviving in a world that gradually forgot he existed. Yet somehow, against all odds, he endured. And as we move into the next chapter of this remarkable story, we'll explore how the world came to remember Hiroo Onoda, how his legacy evolved over time, and why his strange journey continues to fascinate people decades after he finally left the jungle behind. By the time Hiroo Onoda settled into life after his return from the Philippines, he had already become something larger than a person. He had become a symbol. The problem with becoming a symbol, of course, is that everyone starts using you to represent whatever point they already wanted to make. Some people saw Onoda as the ultimate example of loyalty and discipline. Others saw him as a warning about blind obedience. Some viewed him as a hero. Others considered him a tragic figure. Most historians eventually landed somewhere in the middle, which is usually where reality tends to live. As the years passed, Onoda found himself in an unusual position. For nearly 30 years, he had been almost completely forgotten by the world. Now he was constantly being asked to explain himself. Journalists wanted interviews. Authors wanted his memories. Documentary filmmakers wanted details about life in the jungle. People were fascinated not only by what he had done, but by how he had managed to do it for so long. One of the reasons his story attracted so much attention was because it challenged a basic assumption that most people hold about history. We tend to imagine that historical events have clear endings. A war begins. A war ends. Everyone hears the news. Life moves on. The reality is often much messier. News travels slowly. People get left behind. Entire communities can remain trapped in old realities long after the world has changed around them. Onoda's story was an extreme example of this phenomenon, but it wasn't entirely unique. In fact, Onoda was not even the last Japanese holdout discovered after World War II. Other soldiers had remained hidden for years after the war ended. Some emerged in the late 1940s, others in the 1950s. A few managed to remain hidden into the 1970s. Yet none became as famous as Onoda. His story lasted longer, and perhaps more importantly, it seemed to capture something deeply human about the difficulty of letting go. Throughout the late 1970s and 1980s, Onoda frequently spoke about his experiences. He published memoirs describing life on Lubang Island. Readers around the world were fascinated by the details. The daily routines, the constant vigilance, the endless waiting. What many people expected to be a story filled with dramatic action often turned out to be a story filled with repetition. That may actually be one of the most important lessons from his experience. Survival is usually less exciting than movies would have us believe. It is rarely a sequence of thrilling adventures. More often, it is the same tasks repeated over and over again. Finding food, maintaining shelter, staying healthy, conserving energy. Surviving for 30 years is not one heroic moment. It is thousands of ordinary days stacked together. For Onoda, those ordinary days stretched across nearly 3 decades. Imagine watching seasons change year after year, while believing the same mission remained active. Rainy seasons arrived and departed. Trees grew and died. Animals followed their routines. The world kept moving forward, while Onoda remained psychologically anchored to a single moment in time. As he reflected on those years, he often emphasized the importance of duty. To him, his actions made sense within the framework of the orders he had received. Modern audiences sometimes struggle to understand this mindset. Yet for soldiers trained in highly disciplined military systems, obedience can become a central part of identity. Following orders is not simply something you do. It becomes part of who you are. This raises uncomfortable questions that historians continue to debate. When does loyalty become harmful? When should obedience end? At what point should an individual override instructions and trust their own judgment? These are not easy questions. In fact, they may be impossible to answer perfectly. Human history is filled with examples where obedience prevented disaster and examples where obedience created disaster. The challenge lies in recognizing the difference. For Onoda, that distinction never became clear until his commanding officer personally released him from duty. Until that moment, every piece of evidence suggesting the war was over seemed less convincing than the original orders he had received. It sounds extraordinary, but in a way, many people experience smaller versions of the same tendency. Human beings become attached to routines. We continue habits long after they stop serving us. We cling to beliefs because abandoning them feels uncomfortable. We tell ourselves stories about who we are, and then spend years trying to remain consistent with those stories. Onoda simply did this on a scale few people could imagine. As the decades passed, public attitudes toward him gradually evolved. Immediately after his return, media coverage often focused on the dramatic aspects of his story. The hidden soldier, the lost warrior, the man who never surrendered. Over time, however, discussions became more nuanced. Historians examined the broader context of his actions. Scholars explored the psychological and cultural forces that shaped his decisions. The story became less about adventure and more about understanding. Interestingly, Onoda himself seemed to recognize some of this complexity. While he remained proud of his endurance, he also acknowledged the strange circumstances that had led him to spend so much of his life in isolation. Growing older tends to encourage reflection. The certainty of youth often softens with age. Experiences that once seemed straightforward begin revealing additional layers. Meanwhile, the world continued changing at its usual relentless pace. New technologies emerged. Political systems evolved. The internet appeared and transformed communication. Entire industries rose and fell. Through all of it, Onoda occupied a unique place in public memory. He was simultaneously a historical figure and a living person. A reminder that history is not something that exists only in books. Sometimes it sits across from you in an interview chair, quietly describing events that feel impossibly distant. In Japan, Onoda eventually became involved in educational programs focused on outdoor survival and personal development. He believed modern young people could benefit from spending time in nature, learning self-reliance, and developing resilience. Whether one agrees with all of his views or not, there was a certain logic to this perspective. After all, if anyone understood survival, it was probably the man who accidentally turned it into a 30-year hobby. His survival schools emphasized practical skills and discipline. Participants learned how to function outdoors, solve problems, and adapt to challenging circumstances. In many ways, these programs reflected lessons he had learned during his years in isolation. They also represented an attempt to transform a difficult chapter of his life into something useful for future generations. As historians looked back on his story, another interesting theme began to emerge. Onoda's experience highlighted the enormous gap between individual lives and historical events. When we study history, we often focus on dates, battles, treaties, and political leaders. Yet history is also made up of ordinary people responding to circumstances they rarely control. Onoda did not decide the outcome of World War II. He did not shape international diplomacy. He was simply one individual trying to carry out what he believed was his duty. And yet, his choices created consequences that stretched across decades. That is one of history's quiet paradoxes. Most people live ordinary lives. Yet occasionally, ordinary decisions echo far beyond their original moment. A single order given in 1944 continued influencing events well into the 1970s. A choice to remain hidden altered the course of one man's entire existence. Small action sometimes creates surprisingly long shadows. By the early 21st century, Onoda had become one of the last living connections to a rapidly disappearing generation. The veterans of World War II were aging. Their numbers were shrinking. Direct memories of the conflict were gradually fading into history. People increasingly learned about the war through books, documentaries, and archives, rather than personal conversations. This gave Onoda's story additional significance. He represented a living bridge between past and present. Not because he was a famous general or influential politician, but because his life illustrated how deeply historical events can shape individual destinies. In many ways, his story was never really about war. The war simply provided the setting. The deeper themes were endurance, belief, identity, and time itself. What happens when someone becomes so committed to a purpose that they cannot imagine life without it? What happens when the world changes while a person remains the same? And perhaps most importantly, how does someone rebuild a life after spending decades pursuing a mission that no longer exists? These questions remained relevant long after the details of World War II faded from public attention. They continue to resonate because they touch something universal. Almost everyone has experienced moments when reality changes faster than they can adapt. Most of us simply experience those moments on a much smaller scale. As the years drifted by, Onoda lived quietly, reflecting on an extraordinary life that had unfolded in ways nobody could have predicted. The young soldier who entered the jungle expecting a short mission could never have imagined what lay ahead. Neither could the commanders who gave him his orders. History rarely announces its strangest stories in advance. And as we prepare to continue our journey, we'll move beyond the man himself and explore the final years of his life, the way different generations interpreted his legacy, and what happened when one of history's most famous holdouts finally reached the end of his remarkable journey. As the 20th century slowly faded into memory, Hiroo Onoda entered the final chapters of his life. The world around him continued changing at a pace that would have seemed unimaginable to the young soldier who stepped onto Lubang Island in 1944. New generations grew up with no personal memory of World War II. For many young people, the conflict existed only in history books, documentaries, and stories told by grandparents. Yet Onoda remained a living reminder of that era. By now, his story had traveled far beyond Japan. Readers across Europe, North America, and Asia had encountered his remarkable journey. Historians discussed him. Journalists interviewed him. Filmmakers revisited his experiences. Every few years, a new audience would discover the strange tale of the soldier who continued fighting long after the war had ended. What made the story so powerful was not simply its length. Plenty of people have endured difficult circumstances for long periods of time. What fascinated people was the idea that a man could remain loyal to a mission while the entire world transformed around him. It felt almost impossible. Yet there he was, living proof that human beings can hold onto beliefs with astonishing determination. As Onoda grew older, he spent much of his time reflecting on the lessons of his life. Reflection often comes naturally with age. The urgency of youth gradually gives way to perspective. Events that once felt immediate become memories. Victories and failures lose some of their sharp edges. What remains are the patterns that connect them. For Onoda, those patterns often revolved around discipline, perseverance, and responsibility. These were values he had carried with him since childhood. They had helped him survive in the jungle. They had shaped every major decision he made. Whether people agreed with his choices or not, few doubted the consistency with which he lived according to those principles. Consistency is a curious thing. We tend to admire it when it produces admirable outcomes and question it when it leads to difficult ones. History is full of people who remained loyal to ideas for better or worse. Some changed the world. Others became trapped by their convictions. Occasionally, as in Onoda's case, they managed to do both at the same time. Throughout the 1990s and early 2000s, Onoda continued speaking publicly about his experiences. Audiences listened carefully because his story offered something increasingly rare, a first-hand connection to a distant era. There is a unique quality to hearing history, described by someone who actually lived it. Facts become more tangible. Events feel more human. The past seems a little less distant. At the same time, discussions surrounding his legacy became increasingly nuanced. Earlier portrayals had often focused on the dramatic aspects of his survival. The hidden soldier, the jungle holdout, the final warrior. As historians examined the story more closely, they began exploring broader questions. What role had military culture played in his decisions? How had isolation affected his thinking? What responsibilities did individuals carry when following orders? These conversations were not always comfortable. History rarely is. One reason Onoda's story remains so compelling is that it resists simple judgments. It is tempting to divide historical figures into heroes and villains, good people and bad people, wise decisions and foolish decisions. Real life rarely cooperates with such neat categories. Onoda displayed extraordinary endurance. That much is undeniable. He also participated in actions that caused suffering long after the war ended. That too is undeniable. Both realities exist simultaneously. Human beings are often complicated enough to contain contradictions. History merely gives those contradictions more time to develop. As the years passed, another interesting shift occurred. Younger generations began viewing Onoda less as a military figure and more as a psychological one. They became fascinated by the question of belief itself. How does someone maintain certainty for 30 years? How does isolation shape perception? What happens when a person's entire identity becomes tied to a single purpose? These questions felt increasingly relevant in the modern world. While few people found themselves stranded in tropical jungles, many experienced smaller forms of the same challenge. People built identities around careers, ideologies, routines, and assumptions. Sometimes they continued following those paths long after circumstances changed. The scale was different, but the underlying human tendency remained familiar. In this sense, Onoda's story became almost timeless. It was no longer just a World War II story. It became a story about commitment, a story about adaptation, a story about the difficulty of recognizing when a chapter of life has ended. One can imagine how strange modern technology must have seemed to him. During his years in isolation, information traveled slowly. News arrived through newspapers, radio broadcasts, or direct conversations. By the beginning of the 21st century, people carried devices capable of accessing enormous amounts of information instantly. For someone who spent decades distrusting every message he encountered, the modern internet might have seemed particularly amusing. Millions of people arguing about facts while carrying unlimited access to knowledge. History does have a sense of irony. Of course, irony appeared throughout Onoda's life. He had survived one of history's largest wars, only to spend decades fighting a peace that already existed. He had avoided society for 30 years and then become famous. He had dedicated himself to a mission that ended before most of his service actually occurred. And perhaps strangest of all, the very qualities that allowed him to survive also prevented him from returning home sooner. His discipline was both his strength and his prison. As he entered old age, Onoda occasionally revisited Lubang Island. These visits carried deep emotional significance. Returning to the place where he had spent nearly 30 years must have been an unusual experience. The jungle remained. The hills remained. Many of the landscapes were familiar. Yet the meaning attached to them had changed completely. Places often outlive the stories connected to them. A forest does not remember who walked beneath its trees. A mountain does not care who fought upon its slopes. Nature quietly continues while human dramas come and go. The Lubang Island that once served as a battlefield had become simply an island again. Children attended school. Families worked. Daily life continued. History had settled into memory. During these visits, Onoda reportedly met local residents and participated in efforts to improve relations. Time had softened many wounds, though not all. The passage of decades can ease tensions, but it does not erase the past. Understanding this balance is one of the challenges of historical memory. We remember, we learn, but we also move forward. By the early 2010s, Onoda was among the last survivors of an extraordinary generation. The men and women who experienced World War II firsthand were becoming fewer each year. Their stories carried increasing value because direct witnesses were disappearing. In January 2014, Hiroo Onoda died at the age of 91. With his passing, one of the most unusual chapters connected to World War II finally came to an end. News organizations around the world reported his death. Obituaries revisited the details of his remarkable life. Readers once again encountered the image that had captivated people for decades. An aging soldier emerging from a Philippine jungle nearly 30 years after the war ended. Yet perhaps the most interesting aspect of his legacy is how difficult it remains to summarize. Was he a hero? Some believe so. Was he a tragic figure? Others believe that. Was he both? Many historians would probably answer yes. The truth is that history often refuses to provide clean conclusions. Real people are rarely simple. Their lives contain admirable qualities alongside serious flaws. Their decisions create both achievements and consequences. The closer we examine them, the more complicated they become. Onoda's life reminds us that human beings are capable of extraordinary endurance. It also reminds us that certainty can sometimes become dangerous. Loyalty can inspire remarkable acts of perseverance, but it can also prevent adaptation. The same trait can function as both a strength and a weakness, depending on circumstances. That complexity is precisely why his story continues to endure. Not because it offers easy answers, but because it raises enduring questions. Questions about duty. Questions about identity. Questions about what happens when people hold onto the past for too long. As we drift toward the end of tonight's chapter, imagine the long arc of Onoda's life. A young soldier receives orders during a global war. He enters a jungle expecting a temporary assignment. Decades pass. Governments change. Entire generations come and go. Technology transforms civilization. The world races forward. Yet one man remains behind, faithfully waiting for instructions that never arrive. Eventually, those instructions do arrive. The mission ends. The soldier comes home. But the story remains, quietly waiting for future generations to discover it again. And perhaps that is the strange magic of history. The people themselves eventually disappear, but their stories continue wandering through time, waiting for someone to pause, listen, and remember. So for tonight, as the world grows quiet around you and sleep begins to settle in, let the jungle fade into the distance. Let the decades drift by like slow-moving clouds. And remember the forgotten soldier who spent 30 years guarding a war that had already become history. As we continue drifting through the story of Hiroo Onoda, it's worth pausing for a moment to consider something that often gets overlooked. Onoda was famous, certainly. His story traveled around the world. Books were written about him. Documentaries were produced. Historians analyzed every detail of his remarkable survival. Yet he was not entirely alone in his experience. In fact, the strange phenomenon of Japanese soldiers remaining hidden after World War II ended was more common than many people realize. Not common in the sense that thousands of soldiers wandered around jungles for decades, of course. History occasionally produces strange events, but even history has limits. Still, throughout the Pacific, scattered groups of soldiers continued hiding long after the war officially ended. To understand why, we need to return briefly to the final years of World War II. By 1944 and 1945, Japan's military situation had become increasingly desperate. American forces were advancing across the Pacific, capturing islands one after another. Communication lines broke down. Supply networks collapsed. Entire units became isolated from command structures. Some soldiers received confusing orders. Others received no orders at all. When Japan surrendered in August 1945, millions of soldiers eventually learned the news and returned home. But for isolated groups hidden deep within jungles, mountains, and remote islands, reality was not always so straightforward. News does not travel easily through dense forests, especially when the people receiving that news are trained not to trust it. Many soldiers believed surrender announcements were enemy propaganda. Others feared punishment if they emerged. Some genuinely never received reliable information confirming the war's end. Every situation was slightly different. One of the most famous examples besides Onoda was a soldier named Shoichi Yakoi. Unlike Onoda, Yakoi was not conducting military operations. He spent years hiding quietly in the jungles of Guam. His primary goal was survival. Day after day, year after year, he remained concealed while the world moved on without him. Yakoi survived by catching fish, gathering plants, and constructing an underground shelter. The shelter itself was remarkably small. Modern visitors often express disbelief that anyone could live in such confined conditions for so many years. Yet Yakoi endured. Human beings possess an extraordinary ability to adapt. Given enough time, almost any situation can begin to feel normal. That idea may be slightly unsettling when you think about it. Most people struggle when their favorite restaurant changes its menu. Meanwhile, some individuals manage to adjust to living underground for decades. Human adaptability is a very strange thing. Yokoi remained hidden until 1972. Think about that for a moment. The war ended in 1945. He emerged in 1972, 27 years later. When local hunters finally discovered him, the world he entered looked almost as unfamiliar as the one Onoda would encounter 2 years later. Like Onoda, Yokoi became a national sensation in Japan. People wanted answers. How had he survived? Why had he remained hidden? What had life been like all those years? His response to one question became particularly famous. Reflecting on his return, he reportedly expressed embarrassment about coming home alive after such a long absence. The statement reflected values deeply rooted in the military culture of his generation. To modern audiences, the sentiment can seem difficult to understand. Yet history often requires us to examine mindsets very different from our own. That is one reason historical storytelling remains so fascinating. It allows us to briefly step inside worlds that no longer exist. Worlds governed by different assumptions, different fears, different expectations. Another remarkable holdout was Teruo Nakamura. His story differed from both Onoda and Yokoi in important ways. Nakamura had served in the Japanese military, but originally came from Taiwan, which was under Japanese rule at the time. Like others, he became isolated during the war. Like others, he remained hidden. Yet unlike many famous holdouts, he received comparatively little attention after returning. History can be unfair in that way. Some stories become famous. Others fade quietly into the background, often for reasons that have little to do with the individuals involved. Nakamura survived alone for decades on a remote Indonesian island. He built shelters, gathered food, adapted to his environment. When authorities finally located him in 1974, the same year Onoda emerged, many people were astonished. Another soldier, another hidden survivor, another reminder that World War II still cast long shadows across the Pacific. By this point, one begins noticing certain patterns. Isolation, routine. Adaptation, patience. These themes appear repeatedly, and perhaps they reveal something important about survival itself. Popular culture often portrays survival as dramatic. Constant danger, endless action, heroic confrontations. Reality is usually quieter, much quieter. Survival often means waking up and repeating the same tasks day after day. Finding water, finding food, repairing shelter, avoiding illness, managing loneliness, then doing it all again tomorrow, and the next day, and the next, until years begin blending together. This repetitive nature of survival appears throughout history. Polar explorers experienced it. Shipwreck survivors experienced it. Prisoners experienced it. And certainly, the Japanese holdouts experienced it. Many of them spent decades following routines that rarely changed. The jungle became their calendar. Rainy seasons marked the passing years. Trees grew taller. Paths shifted. Animals migrated. Nature became the only reliable measure of time. Meanwhile, the outside world accelerated. Governments changed. New technologies appeared. Popular culture transformed itself repeatedly. Entire industries rose and fell. The contrast is almost difficult to imagine. Somewhere in a remote jungle, a man might be repairing a shelter with hand tools, while humans elsewhere are watching astronauts walk on the moon. History does not move at the same speed everywhere. That may be one of the quiet lessons hidden inside these stories. When we talk about historical periods, we often imagine everyone experiencing them simultaneously. But reality is far more uneven. One person lives in the future. Another remains trapped in the past. Sometimes they coexist at the exact same moment. The holdouts represented perhaps the most extreme version of this phenomenon. They physically occupied the 20th century, while psychologically remaining attached to an earlier era. Time moved forward. Their missions did not. For historians, this creates fascinating questions. What exactly ended World War II for Hiroo Onoda? Was it Japan's surrender in 1945? Was it the leaflet campaigns? Was it the conversations with search teams? Or did the war only truly end when his commanding officer arrived in 1974? The answer depends entirely on perspective. Officially, the war ended in 1945. Psychologically, it ended decades later. And that distinction matters, because human beings do not live inside official timelines. We live inside personal realities. A document can declare a conflict finished. A government can announce peace. Yet individuals may continue carrying the consequences for years, sometimes for lifetimes. As historians examine figures like Onoda, Yokoi, and Nakamura, they often focus on this gap between historical events and human experience. History books prefer clean dates. Real life rarely provides them. Instead, endings unfold gradually, messily, unevenly. A war ends on paper. Then soldiers return home. Families rebuild. Communities recover. Memories linger. Trauma persists. Generations pass. The event continues echoing long after its official conclusion. World War II offers countless examples of this process. The holdouts simply make those echoes visible. Visible in a way that is impossible to ignore. And perhaps that is why these stories continue fascinating people decades later. Not because they are merely unusual, but because they reveal something true about all of us. We like to imagine that change happens instantly. That one chapter ends and another begins. Reality tends to move more slowly. People carry old identities, old beliefs, old fears, old instructions, sometimes for years, occasionally for decades. Fortunately, most of us do not carry rifles through tropical jungles while doing so, though history would certainly be even stranger if we did. As the years passed, the surviving holdouts gradually became symbols of a disappearing era. Their stories reminded younger generations that World War II was not merely a collection of dates in textbooks. It was a lived experience, a reality that shaped individual lives in ways both extraordinary and heartbreaking. For Hiroo Onoda, that reality lasted nearly 30 years longer than anyone expected. Yet as remarkable as his story was, he was part of a larger pattern. A pattern stretching across jungles, islands, mountains, and decades. A pattern revealing how difficult it can be for human beings to recognize that a chapter has ended. And as we drift into the next part of our journey, we'll leave the jungles behind for a moment and explore an even deeper question. What actually happens to the human mind when isolation lasts not months, not years, but decades? Because surviving physically is one challenge, remaining psychologically intact may be an even greater one. As we continue our journey through the life of Hiroo Onoda, it is worth stepping away from the military details for a moment and asking a quieter question. Not how he survived, but what that survival may have done to him. Because surviving physically is one challenge, remaining mentally strong through decades of isolation may be an even greater one. Most people experience loneliness from time to time. Perhaps a quiet weekend, a move to a new city, or a period when friends seem busy and distant. Usually, these experiences pass. Life fills back in. Conversations return. Familiar routines resume. But Onoda's situation was different. His isolation stretched not for days or months, but for nearly 30 years. At first, he lived alongside several other soldiers. Together they shared responsibilities and maintained a sense of purpose. Yet over time the group became smaller. One surrendered. Another was killed. Then another died. Eventually, Onoda found himself almost completely alone. The jungle that once contained a small military unit became a world occupied by a single man. Human beings are social creatures. Even those who enjoy solitude generally rely on regular contact with other people. We learn who we are through conversations, relationships, disagreements, and shared experiences. Without those connections, the mind begins adapting in unusual ways. Time can feel different. Days blend together. Small routines become incredibly important because they provide structure. For Onoda, military discipline likely became a lifeline. Every day followed familiar patterns. He gathered food, checked equipment, observed the surrounding area, watched for signs of enemy activity, repaired clothing and weapons. These tasks were not simply practical. They gave shape to his existence. Without them, the psychological burden of isolation might have been far greater. History offers many examples of people using routine to survive extreme circumstances. Explorers trapped in polar regions created schedules. Prisoners developed rituals. Castaways established daily tasks. The human mind seems to crave order when everything else feels uncertain. A routine becomes a way of proving that another day has meaning. Imagine waking up each morning with no calendar, no television, no newspapers you trust, and no reliable way of measuring the passage of time. The modern world disappears. There are no appointments, no notifications, no social media, no endless stream of opinions from strangers who somehow became experts overnight. There is only the forest, the weather, and your own thoughts. At first glance, that might sound peaceful. Many people dream about escaping modern life. They imagine quiet forests and simple routines. But those fantasies usually last a few minutes before someone remembers that forests contain insects, humidity, and an alarming number of things that want to bite you. The reality of long-term isolation is far less romantic. Over months and years, loneliness changes shape. The absence of conversation becomes normal. The lack of outside perspectives becomes normal. Eventually, a person's internal world grows larger while their external world becomes smaller. Beliefs that might have been challenged in ordinary society can survive untouched for years. This is particularly important when trying to understand Onoda's refusal to accept that the war had ended. Many people assume he simply ignored overwhelming evidence. The reality was more complicated. Every piece of information he received was filtered through decades of military training and isolation. He had been taught that enemy forces would attempt deception. Therefore, messages claiming the war was over seemed suspicious. The longer he remained hidden, the stronger this mindset became. Leaflets announcing peace looked like propaganda. Newspapers looked like propaganda. Letters from family members looked like propaganda. Even photographs and official announcements appeared suspicious. From the outside, the situation seems irrational. Yet inside his isolated world, it followed a strange internal logic. Every new piece of evidence became further proof that the enemy was attempting to trick him. Psychologists sometimes refer to this as a self-reinforcing belief system. Once a person becomes deeply committed to a particular view, contradictory information can actually strengthen the original belief instead of weakening it. Most people experience small versions of this phenomenon. Onoda experienced an extreme version, lasting nearly 3 decades. The jungle itself contributed to this process. Dense forests create a unique environment. Visibility is limited. Sounds travel unpredictably. Distances feel uncertain. Days are shaped by weather patterns rather than schedules. Over time, the natural world becomes more important than events occurring elsewhere. For Onoda, the forest became reality. The wider world became an abstract rumor. While cities expanded, governments changed, and technology advanced, his daily concerns remained remarkably similar. Would it rain today? Was food available nearby? Had anyone entered the area? Did his equipment need repairs? These questions dominated his attention for years. One of the most remarkable aspects of the story is how carefully he maintained his military equipment. Decades passed, yet his rifle remained functional. His ammunition remained protected. His uniform, though worn and damaged, continued serving its purpose. This level of discipline required constant effort. More importantly, it helped preserve his identity. When people lose contact with society, they often cling tightly to whatever identity remains. For Onoda, that identity was simple. He was a soldier carrying out orders. As long as he maintained that role, his life retained structure and meaning. Abandoning the mission would have meant abandoning the identity that had guided him for decades. There is something both admirable and tragic about this. Admirable because few people possess such determination. Tragic because that determination kept him trapped long after the war ended. History frequently presents this kind of paradox. The same qualities that help people survive one situation can become obstacles in another. Courage can become recklessness. Caution can become fear. Loyalty can become inflexibility. Human strengths and weaknesses often differ only in context. When Onoda finally returned to Japan in 1974, he faced a different challenge. Survival was no longer the problem. Adaptation was. After 30 years in isolation, ordinary society must have felt overwhelming. Crowded streets, bright lights, television broadcasts, Modern technology, endless conversations, constant movement. Things most people barely notice could easily feel exhausting. Many former prisoners experience similar difficulties after release. Freedom sounds simple, but it requires adjustment. Suddenly, there are choices to make, responsibilities to manage, relationships to rebuild. The world expects participation after years spent surviving outside it. For Onoda, the adjustment was even more dramatic because Japan itself had transformed. The country he remembered no longer existed. The Japan of 1974 was wealthier, more modern, and far more technologically advanced than the nation he had left behind in 1945. Imagine skipping 30 years of everyday life. No gradual transition. No step-by-step adaptation. Just one enormous leap into the future. That experience alone would challenge almost anyone. Perhaps this helps explain why Onoda eventually found comfort in ranch life in Brazil. Working outdoors provided familiar rhythms. The open landscape felt less overwhelming than crowded cities. Daily work created structure. Nature offered a sense of continuity between his past and present. There is a certain irony in that outcome. A man who spent decades surviving in a jungle eventually discovered peace working outdoors on a ranch. History occasionally writes endings that no novelist would dare invent. Looking back, it is impossible to know exactly what 30 years of isolation felt like from inside Onoda's mind. Some experiences resist complete understanding. We can study them, analyze them, discuss them endlessly. Yet the reality remains personal. What we do know is that he demonstrated an extraordinary capacity for adaptation. Human beings can survive astonishing circumstances. They can build routines from chaos. They can preserve purpose through hardship. They can also become prisoners of the very beliefs that help them endure. That tension lies at the heart of Onoda's story. It is not simply a tale about a soldier lost in the jungle. It is a story about identity, about belief, about the human need for purpose, and about what happens when a person holds on to a mission long after the world has moved on. As we drift toward the next chapter, we will step back from the jungle itself and explore how Hiroo Onoda became a global legend. Because in many ways, his most unusual journey began only after he finally came home. When Hiroo Onoda finally stepped out of the jungle in 1974, his military mission ended. But strangely enough, his real story was only beginning. For nearly 30 years he had lived as an invisible man, hidden, isolated, forgotten by most of the world. Then almost overnight, he became one of the most famous former soldiers on Earth. The transformation was remarkable. One day he was sleeping beneath tropical trees, carefully maintaining an aging rifle and watching for enemies that no longer existed. The next day he was surrounded by reporters, photographers, television crews, and curious crowds eager to hear his story. People could hardly believe it. After all, the world of 1974 looked nothing like the world of 1945. Humans had walked on the moon. Jet aircraft crossed oceans daily. Color television filled living rooms. Computers were beginning to reshape industries. Yet somehow, a man had spent those decades hiding in a jungle while believing World War II was still underway. The story sounded almost fictional. And perhaps that was part of its appeal. Human beings love stories that feel impossible, but happen to be true. We are drawn to tales that challenge our assumptions about what people can endure. Onoda's experience seemed to belong somewhere between history and legend. Journalists quickly recognized this. Newspapers around the world published articles about him. Television networks aired interviews. Magazine covers featured photographs of the former holdout. Readers in countries thousands of miles from Lubang Island suddenly found themselves fascinated by a soldier they had never heard of before. Yet the more people learned about his story, the more complicated it became. At first glance, it appeared simple. A loyal soldier follows orders for 30 years. End of story. But history rarely cooperates with simple explanations. Some observers praised his discipline and determination. They saw him as an example of extraordinary commitment. Others focused on the darker aspects of the story. They pointed out that real people had suffered during his years in hiding. For them, the story was less about heroism and more about the dangers of blind obedience. The debate continues even today. And perhaps that is one reason Onoda remains relevant. Stories that provide easy answers often fade away. Stories that raise difficult questions tend to survive. What exactly should people admire about Onoda? His endurance, his loyalty, his refusal to quit? Or should they focus on the costs of those qualities? Historians continue discussing these questions because there are no perfect answers. As the years passed, Onoda himself became increasingly aware of his unusual position. He was no longer simply a veteran. He had become a symbol. People projected ideas onto him. Some saw patriotism. Others saw tragedy. Some saw strength. Others saw stubbornness. Being a symbol is probably exhausting. Real people are complicated. Symbols are expected to be simple. Yet Onoda's life refused to fit neatly into a single category. One particularly interesting aspect of his fame was the way different generations viewed him. Older people who remembered the war often approached the story differently than younger audiences. Those who had lived through the conflict understood the culture and military values that shaped his decisions. Younger generations, meanwhile, often focused on the psychological aspects of the story. How could someone maintain the same mission for 30 years? How could isolation affect perception? How does a person become so committed to a belief that contrary evidence no longer matters? These questions fascinated psychologists as much as historians. In many ways, Onoda became a case study in human commitment. His story demonstrated how powerful purpose can be. People often underestimate the importance of purpose in everyday life. We assume food, shelter, and physical safety are enough. Yet humans seem to need something more. We need goals. We need direction. We need reasons to get out of bed in the morning. For Onoda, that purpose was his mission. It gave meaning to his suffering. It organized his days. It explained his sacrifices. Without it, the years in the jungle would have been almost impossible to justify. This idea resonated with many people. Not because they planned to hide in jungles for decades, thankfully, but because everyone understands the search for purpose. Whether someone is building a business, raising a family, pursuing a career, or chasing a dream, Purpose gives structure to life. The difference is that most purposes evolve over time. Onoda's remained frozen, and that made his story extraordinary. As his fame spread, writers and filmmakers repeatedly returned to his life. Books explored the details of his survival. Documentaries examined the historical context. Researchers studied military records and interviewed those who knew him. Each retelling emphasized slightly different themes. Some focused on survival. Others focused on loyalty. Others explored the psychological effects of isolation. The remarkable thing is that all of these interpretations contained some truth. A great historical story often works this way. Different audiences discover different meanings. A military historian sees one story. A psychologist sees another. A philosopher sees yet another. Meanwhile, the central figure remains the same. As the 20th century moved toward its end, Onoda gradually became less of a news story and more of a historical figure. This transformation happens to many famous people. First, they exist in headlines. Then they exist in memory. Eventually, they exist in history. The process is slow, almost invisible. One generation remembers meeting them. The next generation remembers hearing about them. The generation after that knows them only through books and recordings. Onoda watched this transition happen in real time. The war that shaped his life moved farther into the past each year. Veterans grew older. Witnesses became fewer. Historical memory slowly replaced personal memory. Yet his story continued attracting attention. Partly because it was unusual. Partly because it was human. And partly because it touched something universal. After all, most people have experienced moments when they held onto something longer than they should have. A belief, a habit, a plan, a dream, an identity. We become attached to these things because they help define who we are. Letting go can feel like losing a part of ourselves. Onoda's story represents that struggle in its most dramatic form. He spent decades holding onto a mission because the mission had become inseparable from his identity. The war ended. His purpose did not. And perhaps that is why audiences continue finding his story so compelling. Beneath the historical details lies a deeply familiar human experience. We all face moments when life changes and asks us to adapt. Sometimes we adapt quickly. Sometimes we resist. Sometimes we spend years learning that a chapter has already ended. Fortunately, most of us receive that lesson through far less dramatic circumstances than a 30-year stay in a Philippine jungle. Still, the underlying challenge remains surprisingly similar. As night settles in around us, imagine the strange journey of Hiroo Onoda. A young soldier enters the jungle expecting a temporary mission. Decades later, he emerges into a completely different world. He becomes famous, writes books, gives interviews, and spends the rest of his life explaining choices made by a much younger version of himself. History can be strange that way. Sometimes a person spends decades trying to avoid being found, only to spend the rest of their life being remembered. And in the next part of our story, we'll explore the final years of Onoda's life and examine the lasting lessons that historians, psychologists, and ordinary people continue drawing from one of the most remarkable survival stories of the modern age. As Hiroo Onoda entered the final decades of his life, The world around him continued moving forward at its usual relentless pace. New technologies appeared. New generations were born. The events that had shaped his youth became subjects for classrooms and documentaries rather than daily conversation. Yet despite the passing years, people remained fascinated by his story. Perhaps that fascination exists because Onoda's life feels like a bridge between two worlds. On one side stands the 20th century, an era of global wars, empires, and military duty. On the other side stands the modern world, with its technology, globalization, and rapidly changing culture. Somehow, one man managed to spend 30 years suspended between those two realities. By the 1980s and 1990s, Onoda had largely settled into a quieter life. He spent time in both Brazil and Japan, participated in educational programs, and occasionally spoke about his experiences. The intense media attention surrounding his return gradually faded. Journalists moved on to newer stories. Headlines changed. The world found fresh distractions, as it always does. History has a habit of turning extraordinary events into ordinary memories. What once dominates every newspaper eventually becomes a chapter in a book. What once feels immediate slowly becomes distant. The same thing happened with Onoda. Yet even as public attention diminished, scholars and historians continued examining his story. They weren't simply interested in the details of his survival. They were interested in what those details revealed about human nature. After all, survival was only part of the story. The deeper questions remained. Why do people become attached to certain beliefs? How much evidence does it take to change someone's mind? What happens when identity becomes tied to a single purpose? And perhaps most importantly, how do people know when it's time to let go? These questions extend far beyond military history. They appear everywhere. Businesses continue pursuing failed strategies because too much has already been invested. Leaders cling to outdated ideas because admitting error feels impossible. Individuals remain trapped in routines that no longer serve them because those routines have become familiar. The scale is different, certainly. Most people are not hiding in tropical jungles. At least hopefully not. But the underlying psychology can feel surprisingly familiar. Onoda's story reminds us that humans are remarkably consistent creatures. We crave certainty. We seek meaning. We build identities around our choices. Once those identities become established, changing course can feel deeply uncomfortable, sometimes even when change is necessary. One of the most striking aspects of Onoda's life is how thoroughly he committed himself to a mission. Modern audiences often admire flexibility and adaptation. Those qualities are valuable. Yet there is also something undeniably impressive about unwavering commitment. The challenge lies in knowing when commitment becomes stubbornness. History offers examples of both outcomes. Some of humanity's greatest achievements emerged because people refused to quit. Some of humanity's greatest mistakes occurred for exactly the same reason. Determining the difference is rarely easy. For Onoda, that distinction remained blurred for decades. His training told him to continue. His experience reinforced that instruction. His isolation prevented meaningful challenges to his worldview. By the time opportunities to leave appeared, remaining had become easier than changing. In many ways, his story serves as a reminder that human beings do not simply respond to reality. We respond to our interpretation of reality. That distinction matters. Two people can observe the same evidence and reach entirely different conclusions. One sees proof. Another sees deception. One sees opportunity. Another sees danger. Onoda interpreted the world through the lens of a soldier carrying out orders. Everything else followed from that. As he grew older, many people wondered whether he regretted spending so much of his life in the jungle. The answer was never entirely straightforward. Like most complex experiences, his reflections contained a mixture of pride, acceptance, and contemplation. He understood that his story was unusual. He understood that many people viewed his actions differently. Yet he also understood that the young man who entered the jungle in 1944 had been shaped by circumstances difficult for later generations to fully appreciate. This is another challenge historians often face. It is easy to judge the past using modern assumptions. It is much harder to understand people within the context of their own time. That does not mean every historical decision should be excused. Nor does it mean every action should be condemned. It simply means understanding comes before judgment. The best historians try to explain first and evaluate second. Onoda's life benefits from that approach. The more closely one examines his story, the more complicated it becomes. He was neither a simple hero nor a simple villain. Neither a fool nor a genius. He was a human being navigating extraordinary circumstances with the tools, beliefs, and experiences available to him. In that sense, he resembles countless figures throughout history. The difference is that his circumstances happen to be unusually dramatic. As the years passed, the image most people remembered remained remarkably consistent. An aging soldier emerging from the jungle in full uniform, carrying a rifle from a war that ended decades earlier. The image feels symbolic because it captures something universal. All of us carry pieces of the past. Old habits, old assumptions, old fears, old ambitions. Most of the time, these things help us navigate the world. Occasionally, they prevent us from seeing how much the world has changed. The challenge is recognizing which is which. Onoda's story transforms that challenge into something visible. A man literally carrying the past on his shoulders. A man stepping from one era into another. A man discovering that history had continued without him. Perhaps that is why his story continues attracting readers and viewers decades after his death. Beneath the military details lies a timeless theme. The tension between holding on and moving forward. Every generation faces that tension. Every person faces it sooner or later. Some chapters of life require persistence. Others require release. Wisdom often consists of knowing the difference. As the evening grows quieter and our journey approaches its end, imagine once more the forests of Lubang Island. The rain drifting through the trees. The distant sounds of birds. The hidden paths winding through dense vegetation. Somewhere among those hills, a young soldier once waited patiently for orders that never seemed to arrive. Years became decades. Decades became a lifetime. Yet eventually, even the longest missions end. Eventually, even the most determined holdouts return home. And in the final part of our story, We'll look at Hiroo Onoda's last years, his death in 2014, and the enduring legacy left behind by one of the most unusual figures in modern history. As the final years of Hiroo Onoda's life unfolded, the extraordinary story that had begun in the final months of World War II slowly approached its conclusion. By now, he had spent more years living in peace than he had spent in the jungle. Yet no matter what else he accomplished, people continued returning to the same remarkable chapter of his life. The hidden soldier, the jungle holdout, the man who refused to believe the war had ended. It is easy to understand why those images remained powerful. They seemed to belong to another world entirely. A slower world, a harsher world, a world where messages traveled by radio instead of smartphones, and where entire armies could disappear into remote forests. Yet for Onoda, those events were not symbols. They were memories, real places, real decisions, real years of his life. As he entered his 80s, the number of people who shared his wartime experiences grew smaller each year. Veterans from World War II were aging rapidly. The generation that had witnessed the conflict firsthand was gradually disappearing. History was passing from memory into record. This transition happens with every generation. At first, history is lived. Then it is remembered. Finally, it is studied. By the beginning of the 21st century, World War II had largely entered that final stage. Most people learned about it through books, films, and classrooms rather than personal experience. That reality gave Onoda a unique role. He became one of the last living links to a distant era. Not because he had commanded armies or shaped global events, but because his life illustrated how deeply history can affect an individual. His story reminded people that major historical events are ultimately experienced one person at a time. Wars are fought by individuals. Orders are received by individuals. Consequences are carried by individuals, sometimes for the rest of their lives. Throughout his later years, Onoda occasionally participated in interviews and public appearances. Audiences remained fascinated by the same questions that had followed him since 1974. What was it like to live alone for so long? Did he ever doubt his mission? Did he ever consider surrendering? How did it feel to discover that 3 decades had passed? No answer could fully satisfy those questions. Some experiences resist explanation. How do you summarize 30 years of isolation? How do you compress thousands of days into a few sentences? How do you explain a reality that no longer exists? Perhaps that is why his story continues attracting attention. There remains something mysterious about it. No matter how many books are written or documentaries produced, part of the experience remains inaccessible. The jungle existed inside his memory in ways nobody else could completely share. As historians continued examining his life, a consensus gradually emerged. The most interesting aspect of the story was not whether Onoda was right or wrong. It was how thoroughly human he was. That may sound obvious, but history often turns people into symbols, heroes, villains, legends, warnings. The real individuals behind those labels tend to disappear. Onoda's story becomes more meaningful when viewed through a human lens. A young soldier receives orders during a global conflict. He follows those orders with extraordinary dedication. Circumstances isolate him from the world. Years pass. The mission becomes his identity. Eventually, he discovers that history moved on without him. Strip away the uniforms and military details, and the emotional structure becomes surprisingly familiar. Many people spend years pursuing goals that no longer fit their lives. Many people cling to old versions of themselves. Many people struggle to recognize when one chapter has ended and another should begin. Onoda simply experienced that challenge on a scale almost impossible to imagine. By the early 2010s, he had become a respected, if somewhat enigmatic figure. Public attitudes toward him remained varied. Some admired his perseverance. Others viewed his story more critically. Most recognized that simple judgments failed to capture the complexity of his life. Complexity, after all, is one of history's defining features. The closer we look, the less simple things become. On January 16, 2014, Hiroo Onoda died in Tokyo at the age of 91. News of his death spread around the world. Major newspapers published obituaries. Television networks revisited his story. Writers reflected on his legacy. For a brief moment, the world once again remembered the soldier who spent nearly 30 years waiting for orders in a Philippine jungle. With his death, one of the final living connections to an extraordinary historical episode disappeared. Yet the story itself survived. Stories often outlive the people who create them. Generations pass. Memories fade. But certain narratives continue traveling through time. This is one of them. Today, people who were not even born when Onoda emerged from the jungle continue discovering his story. They read about his survival. They debate his decisions. They wonder what they might have done under similar circumstances. The answers vary. The fascination remains. And perhaps it remains because Onoda's story contains no neat moral lesson. There is no simple message waiting at the end. Instead, there are questions. Questions about duty. Questions about belief. Questions about identity. Questions about the relationship between determination and flexibility. Questions that remain relevant regardless of century or culture. That may be the true reason the story endures. Not because it is strange, although it certainly is. Not because it is dramatic, although it certainly can be. But because it reveals something timeless about human beings. We all carry missions of one kind or another. We all tell ourselves stories about who we are. We all struggle at times to recognize when circumstances have changed. Sometimes persistence is exactly what we need. Sometimes letting go is the wiser choice. The challenge is knowing which moment we are living through. As our journey comes to an end, picture Lubang Island one final time. The forests remain. The hills remain. Rain still falls through the trees, just as it did decades ago. Nature continues its quiet work, largely indifferent to human history. Somewhere among those forests, a young soldier once waited for orders. Days became months. Months became years. Years became decades. The world changed around him. Empires disappeared. Technology transformed civilization. Humans walked on the moon. The Cold War came and went. Generations were born and grew old. And still he waited. Eventually, the orders arrived. The mission ended. The soldier came home. and the story passed into history. So tonight, as the world grows quiet around you and sleep begins to settle in, let the jungle fade into the distance. Let the decades drift away. Let the story rest where it belongs now, not in the forests of Lubang, but in the long, strange archive of human history. A history filled with wars and kingdoms, triumphs and mistakes, heroes and fools. And occasionally, a forgotten soldier who kept fighting long after everyone else had gone home. As we continue our gentle journey through the story of Hiroo Onoda, it is worth pausing to think about something surprisingly easy to overlook. While Onoda spent nearly 30 years hidden in the jungles of Lubang Island, the rest of humanity was living through one of the most transformative periods in modern history. When he entered the jungle in 1944, the world was still at war. When he emerged in 1974, the world had become almost unrecognizable. Think about that for a moment. While Onoda was building shelters, gathering food, and watching distant coastlines for signs of enemy activity, entire chapters of history were unfolding without him. In 1945, the Second World War ended. Millions celebrated. Cities began rebuilding. Soldiers returned home. Families reunited. A new world slowly emerged from the ruins. Yet Onoda never witnessed any of it. The celebrations never reached him. The victory announcements never convinced him. The peace agreements remained distant rumors carried by leaflets he believed were enemy tricks. Then came the Cold War. The United States and the Soviet Union entered a long geopolitical rivalry that would shape global politics for decades. Entire generations grew up under the shadow of nuclear weapons. Governments rose and fell. Crises erupted around the world. Yet none of it reached the hidden soldier in the jungle. The Korean War happened. The Vietnam War began. New nations gained independence. Empires disappeared. Maps changed. Flags changed. The political landscape of the world transformed itself. Meanwhile, Onoda continued carrying out patrols through tropical forests. The contrast feels almost impossible to comprehend. History was racing forward. His life remained frozen. The technological changes were equally astonishing. Television entered millions of homes. Commercial aviation became commonplace. Household appliances transformed daily life. Computers began appearing in businesses and research centers. People watched live broadcasts from across the globe. Information traveled faster than ever before. Yet Onoda remained in a world where information moved at the speed of footsteps. A newspaper dropped from an airplane represented cutting-edge communication technology from his perspective. And even then, he rarely trusted it. Perhaps the most remarkable moment occurred in 1969. Humans landed on the moon. Neil Armstrong stepped onto the lunar surface, while hundreds of millions watched from Earth. It remains one of humanity's most famous achievements. Imagine the contrast. At the exact moment people were walking on another world, Hiroo Onoda was hiding in a jungle, maintaining a rifle from World War II. One human being experienced the most advanced technology ever created. Another remained psychologically anchored to 1945. Both existed at the same time. History can be strange that way. Music changed too. When Onoda entered the jungle, swing music was popular. By the time he emerged, the world had experienced jazz revolutions, rock and roll, the Beatles, folk music, psychedelic rock, and countless cultural movements. Entire musical eras came and went. Fashion changed repeatedly. Some of those changes were quite successful. Others were less successful. History has produced many great achievements. Certain 1970s hairstyles are not generally considered among them. Yet Onoda missed every trend, every cultural shift, every passing fad. He stepped out of the jungle into a society that looked and sounded entirely different from the one he remembered. There is something oddly moving about this realization. Most people experience change gradually. One year becomes the next. Technology evolves little by little. Fashion changes slowly enough that we barely notice. But Onoda skipped the gradual process. He experienced decades of change all at once. Imagine leaving home with a radio and returning to find televisions everywhere. Imagine leaving before commercial jets became common and returning to a world connected by global air travel. Imagine leaving before humans reached space and returning after they had already walked on the moon. The adjustment must have been extraordinary. Yet perhaps the most important thing Onoda missed was not technology. It was ordinary life. Birthdays, weddings, family gatherings, conversations, friendships, small moments that seem insignificant while they are happening. History books rarely mention such things, yet they form the fabric of everyday existence. For nearly 30 years, Onoda lived without them. He survived. But survival and living are not always the same thing. That realization gives his story an additional layer of sadness. Because while the world remembers the remarkable endurance, it is easy to forget the years that could never be recovered. Time, after all, is the one resource nobody can replace. Not soldiers, not kings, not emperors, not historians. No matter how remarkable a person may be, lost years remain lost. And perhaps that is one of the quiet lessons hidden within Onoda's story. Life is happening while we are busy preparing for it. The future arrives whether we notice or not. History keeps moving. The world keeps changing. And sometimes the greatest challenge is recognizing when it is time to move forward with it. As our story finally draws toward its conclusion, let us return one last time to Lubang Island. The jungle is quiet. Rain falls gently through the trees. Leaves sway in the tropical breeze. Birds call somewhere in the distance. Nature continues exactly as it always has. The forest does not know that it became famous. It does not know that historians study its paths. It does not know that millions of people would eventually hear the story of the soldier who once hid beneath its canopy. To the jungle, it was simply another human passing through. Yet for Hiroo Onoda, those forests became the center of an entire lifetime. When he first arrived, he was 22 years old, young, determined, certain of his purpose. Like many young people, he believed he understood exactly what the future would look like. History had other ideas. History usually does. The future rarely asks permission before arriving. The young soldier expected weeks or months of resistance. Instead, he received decades. He expected new orders. Instead, he received silence. He expected reinforcements. Instead, he received isolation. Yet through it all, he continued moving forward one day at a time. That may be the most human part of the entire story. Not the survival, not the fame, not the headlines, the simple act of continuing. Human beings are remarkably good at continuing. We survive difficult periods not because we know how the story ends, but because we focus on the next day, the next task, the next meal, the next sunrise. That was Onoda's reality for nearly 30 years. One day at a time, one season at a time, one year blending quietly into the next. Then eventually, the impossible happened. The mission ended. The soldier came home. And what happened afterward was perhaps even stranger. Life continued. No dramatic final battle. No grand victory parade. Just an older man learning how to exist in a world that had changed without him. In many ways, that is how most stories end. Not with fireworks, not with dramatic speeches, but with adaptation, with reflection, with ordinary days. As the years passed, Onoda became less of a soldier and more of a storyteller. People asked questions. He shared memories. The jungle gradually transformed from a reality into a recollection. A chapter instead of a destination. And eventually, like all human beings, he reached the end of his journey. When he died in 2014, newspapers around the world revisited his remarkable life. Readers once again encountered the image of the forgotten soldier, emerging from the jungle after 30 years. Yet perhaps the true legacy of Hiroo Onoda is not military at all. Perhaps it is a reminder about time. Time keeps moving, whether we move with it or not. The years pass. The seasons change. Entire worlds disappear and are replaced by new ones. And throughout that process, each of us faces the same challenge. Knowing what to hold onto. Knowing what to let go. As the night grows quieter and our journey finally comes to an end, imagine the jungle fading slowly into darkness. The trees disappear. The rain grows distant. The hidden trails vanish into memory. And somewhere far away, a forgotten soldier finally lowers his rifle, receives his last orders, and begins the long walk home. The mission is over. The war is over. The story is over. And at last, after decades of waiting, the jungle is quiet once again.